Did medieval people understand germs? The short answer is no, not in the way we do. They couldn't see microscopic bacteria or viruses. They had no idea that tiny living things could invade their bodies and make them sick. That whole concept was centuries away. But that doesn't mean they were clueless about disease. They had their own ideas, they had complex systems to explain why people got sick and died. And they weren't just shrugging their shoulders, they were trying to make sense of a dangerous world. To understand their world, you have to forget ours for a minute. Forget biology class. Forget hand sanitizer. Imagine a world where the ultimate explanation for almost everything was God. If a plague swept through your town, the first and most obvious answer was that God was angry. Sickness was a punishment for sin. It could be your personal sin or the sin of your whole community. This wasn't a fringe idea. It was the central, guiding principle of life. Priests preached it. Kings believed it. Peasants feared it. When illness struck, the first response was often spiritual. People prayed. They went on pilgrimages. They tried to appease a wrathful God. It was a perfectly logical conclusion in a world steeped in faith. But they also had what they considered a scientific framework. It was an ancient system, inherited from the Greeks and Romans, particularly the physician Galen. This was the theory of the four humors. The idea was that the human body was made of four basic fluids, or humors. These were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was linked to a season and an element. Blood was spring and air. Phlegm was winter and water. Yellow bile was summer and fire. And black bile was autumn and earth. A healthy person had all four of these humors in perfect balance. Sickness happened when one of the humors was out of balance. Too much phlegm, for example, caused a cough or a cold. Too much black bile made you melancholic, or what we would call depressed. This wasn't just a vague idea. It was a detailed, sophisticated system of medicine. A doctor's entire job was to figure out which humor was out of whack and then try to rebalance it. Every diagnosis, every treatment was based on this foundation. They would look at the color of a patient's urine. They would check their pulse. They would ask about their diet and their mood. All these clues helped the doctor determine the humoral imbalance. If you were diagnosed with an excess of blood, the treatment was obvious: get some of it out. This is where bloodletting came from. It sounds barbaric to us, but to a medieval physician, it was a precise medical procedure designed to restore health. So they would use leeches or make a small cut to drain the excess humor. The third big idea was miasma. This was the theory of bad air. People believed that disease was carried in the air, but not as invisible germs. They thought it was a kind of poisonous vapor or mist. This miasma rose from rotting things. It came from swamps, from garbage heaps, from open sewers, from dead bodies. It had a foul smell. And for medieval people, a bad smell wasn't just unpleasant. It was a sign of danger. That stench was the disease itself, traveling through the air, waiting to be inhaled. If you breathed in the miasma, you would get sick. This idea had a huge impact on daily life. It explains why people in cities were so concerned with bad smells. They would burn incense in their homes. Wealthy people carried around pomanders, which were little metal balls filled with sweet-smelling herbs and spices, and held them to their noses in crowded places. They thought the good smell would drive away the bad, disease-carrying air. It also led to some of the first attempts at public health. City authorities would order the streets to be cleaned of animal dung and garbage. Butchers were told to dispose of their waste properly. They weren't doing this because they understood sanitation in a modern sense. They were doing it to fight the miasma. They were fighting the smell. So you have these three main ideas working together: divine punishment, humoral imbalance, and miasma. They could all exist at the same time. A plague could be a punishment from God, which was carried on a foul wind and which caused a fatal imbalance of the humors in a person's body. These weren't just wild guesses. They were a complete intellectual toolkit for understanding sickness. They provided an explanation for why things happened, and they suggested actions people could take, whether it was praying, changing their diet, or simply avoiding a smelly part of town. They were wrong about the underlying mechanism, of course, but they were actively observing their world and trying to figure it out with the knowledge they had. They saw a connection between filth and disease, and they came up with miasma. They saw how sickness can make a person's body change, and they developed humoral theory. It was a world without microscopes, a world built on what you could see, smell, and touch. And in that world, their theories made a lot of sense. Living in a medieval town or village meant constantly dealing with the threat of sickness. It was a part of life. And people used their understanding of the world, their theories about miasma and humors, to navigate that threat every day. Their actions were a direct result of their beliefs. It was a practical, hands-on approach to staying alive. The fight against miasma was everywhere. You could see it in the streets. While medieval cities are often imagined as incredibly filthy, and they often were, there were real efforts to clean them up. People understood that filth created bad smells, and bad smells meant disease, so town councils would pass regulations. They would hire people called gong farmers to clean out cesspits, usually at night to minimize the stench. They would fine people for dumping trash in the river or leaving dead animals in the street. These weren't perfect systems. They were often overwhelmed, but the effort was there. It was a constant battle against the foul air they believed was trying to kill them. Inside the home, the same principles applied. A good medieval housewife knew the importance of cleanliness, not for hygiene as we know it, but to keep the air sweet. The floors would be covered with rushes, which were herbs like lavender and chamomile. These rushes would be swept out and replaced regularly. They helped absorb spills and dirt, and they released a pleasant scent when walked on. People would burn fragrant woods like juniper or rosemary in their fireplaces. During a time of sickness, this would be done even more. The smoke and strong scent were thought to purify the air in the house, creating a protective barrier against the miasma lurking outside. It was a kind of atmospheric warfare. Then there was personal medicine, which was dominated by the humoral theory. When you got sick, you would likely see a physician, an apothecary, or maybe just the wise woman in your village. The diagnosis would be based on your humors. If you had a fever, you were considered too hot and dry. The physician would diagnose an excess of yellow bile. The treatment would be to introduce things that were cold and wet. You might be told to eat cucumbers or melons. You might be given a tea made from herbs considered to be cold like violets or water lilies. Every food, every herb, every spice had a humoral property. A whole system of medicine was built around this idea of balancing opposites. Bloodletting was the most dramatic example of this. It was a common treatment for a huge range of ailments, from fevers to headaches to simple feelings of sluggishness. The physician believed these were caused by an excess of blood, which was a hot and moist humor. By removing some blood, they thought they could cool the body down and restore balance. It was a very visual and direct way of dealing with the problem. The same logic applied to purging. If the doctor believed the sickness was caused by bad food creating a humoral imbalance in your stomach, they would give you something to make you vomit or have diarrhea. The goal was to expel the corrupt humor from the body as quickly as possible. To them, this wasn't a punishment. It was a cleansing. Beyond the formal medicine of physicians, there was a world of folk remedies and superstitions. These often blended with humoral theory and Christian belief. People wore amulets to ward off disease. These might contain a special stone, a bit of dried herb, or a written prayer. The lines were blurry between medicine, magic, and religion. If a child had a fever, a mother might sponge them with cool water, a practical action that actually works. But she might also say a specific prayer while doing it, believing the words themselves had healing power. Herbalism was a huge part of everyday health. Most households, especially in the countryside, had a small garden with medicinal herbs. People knew that mint was good for an upset stomach, or that willow bark could help with pain. This was knowledge passed down through generations. Much of it was genuinely effective. We now know that willow bark contains salicin, which is the active ingredient in aspirin. They didn't know the chemistry, but they knew it worked through trial and error. Of course, this practical knowledge was mixed in with magical beliefs. They might believe that the herb only worked if it was picked under a full moon, or if a certain incantation was said over it. Life was a constant negotiation with invisible forces. Whether it was the bad air from a swamp, an imbalance of your internal fluids, or the will of God, sickness was an active threat. So people responded actively. They cleaned their streets, aired out their homes, wore good-smelling charms, and carefully chose their foods. They sought out doctors for bleeding and purging, and they used ancient herbal remedies passed down by their grandmothers. They were not passive victims. They were using every tool they had, both physical and spiritual, to protect themselves and their families. Their reasoning was often wrong, but their actions were born from a deep-seated desire to control their own health in a world full of danger. Nothing tested the medieval understanding of disease like the Black Death. When it arrived in Europe in the mid-14th century, it was a catastrophe on a scale that nobody could comprehend. It wasn't just another sickness, it was an apocalypse. It swept through communities, killing a third, sometimes half, of the population. It was fast, it was gruesome, and it was unstoppable. This terrifying event pushed every existing belief system to its absolute limit. And in the process, it started to change how people thought about sickness itself. The first and most powerful reaction was religious. The sheer scale of the death seemed to be beyond any natural explanation. This had to be the hand of God. It was a punishment for the sins of humanity, a final judgment delivered upon a wicked world. This belief led to desperate acts of piety. People flocked to churches. They prayed for deliverance. They made public confessions of their sins. In some parts of Europe, groups of flagellants appeared. These were men who would walk from town to town, whipping themselves in public as a form of penance. They believed that by punishing their own bodies, they could convince God to spare humanity. They were a dramatic and terrifying sight, a living symbol of the fear and desperation that gripped the continent. This religious explanation also had a dark side. When people are terrified and looking for someone to blame, they often turn on the vulnerable. Minority groups were accused of causing the plague. In many towns, Jewish communities were blamed for poisoning the wells. This led to horrific massacres. Lepers and other outsiders were also targeted. It was a desperate search for a human cause for a disaster that felt supernatural. If they could find and punish the culprits, maybe the plague would stop. It was a tragic outcome of a world trying to find order in complete chaos. At the same time, the existing medical theories were put to the test. Doctors did everything they could based on their understanding of miasma and humors. The miasma theory went into overdrive. The plague was believed to be a particularly deadly form of bad air, a pestilence that corrupted everything it touched. To fight it, doctors and city officials tried to purify the air. They ordered massive bonfires to be lit in the streets. They rang church bells constantly, believing the vibrations could break up the poisonous miasma. They burned aromatic substances like sulfur and arsenic, hoping the powerful smells would drive away the plague. The image of the plague doctor with the long beak-like mask comes from this period, although it became more common in later outbreaks. The beak was not just for show, it was a primitive gas mask. It was stuffed with herbs and spices like mint, cloves, and camphor. The doctor would breathe through this herbal concoction, believing it would filter out the deadly air. They also wore long, waxed leather coats, gloves, and hats. They were trying to create a full body shield against the miasma. It was a terrifying look, but it was born from a theory of how disease spread. Doctors also tried to treat the sick using humoral theory. The buboes, the painful swellings in the armpits and groin that gave the bubonic plague its name, were seen as a sign that the body was trying to expel the poison. So doctors would try to help the process along. They would lance the buboes to let the corrupt fluid out. They would apply poultices made of things like figs and onions to draw out the poison. They prescribed complex herbal remedies, and of course they used bloodletting, but nothing worked. People died no matter what the doctors did. The healthy died. The sinful died. The pious died. Doctors died. Priests died. The sheer randomness and speed of the plague defied their medical system. The idea that a simple imbalance of humors could cause such a swift and total collapse of the body started to seem inadequate. But amidst all the fear and confusion, a new idea began to take hold. It was based on simple, brutal observation. People noticed that the plague seemed to spread from person to person. It arrived in a town with a ship. It spread from a sick person to their family and then to their neighbors. You could get sick just by being near someone who was sick, or even by touching their clothes. This sounded less like bad air, which should affect everyone in a certain area at once, and more like some kind of poison that was being passed around. This was the beginning of a practical understanding of contagion. It wasn't a formal theory yet. They had no idea what was being transmitted. They sometimes called it a seed of disease, or a venom. But they saw the pattern. The plague traveled along trade routes. It moved from port to port, then inland. It spread through contact. And this observation, born from the trauma of the Black Death, would lead to one of the most important public health innovations in human history. The old theories hadn't been able to stop the plague, but maybe this new idea of person-to-person spread could. The world had been changed forever, and the way people thought about disease was about to change with it. The Black Death left a deep scar in the medieval world, but it also left an important lesson learned through horrifying experience. The lesson was that disease could be contagious. It could spread from one person to another. This idea wasn't entirely new. People had long isolated those with diseases like leprosy. But the plague made the concept of contagion impossible to ignore. It was a powerful, observable fact. And this new understanding, even without a knowledge of germs, led to practical actions that started to look a lot like modern public health. The most significant of these actions was quarantine. The word itself comes from this period. When the plague returned in later waves, port cities like Venice and Ragusa, which were major hubs of trade, were particularly vulnerable. They saw how ships arriving from infected areas brought the disease with them, so they came up with a radical idea. They decided to isolate incoming ships, crews, and cargo for a period of time to see if the disease would develop. Initially, this was for 30 days, called a Trentino. Later, they extended it to 40 days, a quarantino, which is where we get the word quarantine. This was a huge step. It was a public policy based entirely on the principle of contagion. The authorities didn't know what they were waiting for, exactly. They just knew that if they kept potentially infected people and goods separate from the healthy population for long enough, they could stop the disease from entering their city. It was an incredible logistical challenge. Ships were forced to anchor in the harbor. Special islands, called lazarettos, were set up to house the crews and passengers. Guards were posted to prevent anyone from breaking the quarantine. It caused massive disruptions to trade and was deeply unpopular with merchants. But it worked. Cities that enforced strict quarantines often fared better in subsequent plague outbreaks than those that did not. This idea of isolation was also applied on land. When the plague broke out within a city, authorities would sometimes implement a form of lockdown. They would identify the house where someone was sick and seal it up. Sometimes the whole family, healthy and sick, would be shut inside. A guard would be placed outside to prevent anyone from leaving. Food and supplies would be passed through a window. It was a brutal and often fatal policy for the family trapped inside, but the goal was to protect the wider community. It showed a clear understanding that the sickness was contained within people and their immediate surroundings, and that creating a physical barrier could stop its spread. They also started to understand that objects could carry the disease. This was the idea of fomites, though they didn't use that word. They noticed that the plague could spread from the belongings of the sick. The clothes and bedding of a plague victim were considered incredibly dangerous. After a person died, city officials would order their belongings to be either burned or aired out in the sun for a long period. Letters from infected areas were sometimes smoked or doused in vinegar before being read. They were trying to cleanse these objects of the seeds of the plague. Again, they didn't know about bacteria surviving on surfaces. But their observations led them to a remarkably effective precaution. Thinkers of the late medieval and early Renaissance period began to formalize this idea. An Italian physician named Girolamo Fracastoro, writing in the 1540s, came remarkably close to a germ theory. He proposed that diseases were caused by tiny, self-replicating particles, which he called seminaria, or seeds of contagion. He suggested that these seeds could be spread in 3 ways: by direct contact with a sick person, by contact with their contaminated belongings, or through the air over a short distance. This was a revolutionary way of thinking. It moved away from the vague idea of miasma and proposed a physical, particle-based cause for disease. Fracastoro had no proof. He couldn't see these particles. His theory was based entirely on observation and logic. But he was describing, in essence, germ theory more than 300 years before it would be proven. This growing understanding of contagion coexisted with the older ideas. People still believed in miasma. They still thought bad smells were dangerous, and they certainly still believed in humoral medicine. A doctor treating a quarantined plague patient would still try to balance their humors. But a new layer of understanding had been added. Disease was not just in the air in general, it was concentrated around the sick. It was a specific threat that could be contained and isolated. This was a fundamental shift. It moved the focus from passive measures like carrying sweet-smelling flowers to active, organized public health interventions. Quarantines, lockdowns, and the disinfection of goods were the first large-scale, systematic attempts to control the spread of an epidemic. They were born not from a scientific breakthrough in a laboratory, but from the raw, painful experience of watching millions die. Medieval people didn't know about germs, but they learned enough about how disease behaved to invent the tools that would, in time, help to conquer them. They learned that separation meant survival. The road from the medieval idea of contagion to our modern understanding of germs was a long one. It was a slow, piecemeal process of discovery that took centuries. The medieval world, through its hard-won experience with plagues and its practical invention of quarantine, had laid a crucial piece of the foundation. They had established that diseases could be passed from person to person, but they were still missing the most important part of the puzzle to culprit. They knew something was being transmitted, but they had no idea what it was. The first real glimpse into the unseen world came in the 17th century with the invention of the microscope. A Dutch cloth merchant named Antony van Leeuwenhoek, who had a passion for grinding lenses, built a simple but powerful microscope. He started looking at everything with it. He looked at pond water, at scrapings from his own teeth, at blood, and he saw things no one had ever seen before. He described a world teeming with tiny living creatures, which he called animalcules. He was the first human to see bacteria and other microorganisms. It was an astonishing discovery. But for a long time, it was just a curiosity. No one made the connection between these tiny creatures and disease. They were just another strange part of nature. For the next 200 years, medical science continued to operate largely on the old principles. Miasma theory remained dominant. Doctors and city planners in the 18th and 19th centuries still believed that diseases like cholera and typhoid were caused by foul air rising from filth. The humoral theory slowly faded, but no single powerful theory replaced it. Sickness was still a mystery. Then, in the mid-19th century, a few crucial observations began to change everything. In Vienna, a doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis was working in a maternity clinic. He was horrified by the high number of women dying from childbed fever. He noticed that women who were treated by doctors who had just come from performing autopsies were much more likely to die than women treated by midwives. He didn't know why, but he suspected the doctors were carrying some kind of cadaverous particles on their hands. He ordered his staff to wash their hands in a chlorine solution between patients. The death rate plummeted. Semmelweis couldn't prove what was happening, and he was ridiculed by the medical establishment. But he had shown that a simple act of hygiene could prevent the spread of a deadly disease. Around the same time, in London, a physician named John Snow was investigating a severe cholera outbreak. The common belief was that the cholera was caused by miasma, a bad smell hanging over the city. But Snow was skeptical. He meticulously mapped the cases and found they were all clustered around a single public water pump on Broad Street. He theorized that the disease was not in the air but in the water. To prove it, he did something simple and dramatic. He convinced the local authorities to remove the handle from the pump. The outbreak quickly subsided. Like Semmelweis, Snow had stopped an epidemic without ever seeing the germ that caused it. He had used logic and observation to identify the method of transmission. The final, definitive proof came from the work of two brilliant scientists, Louis Pasteur in France and Robert Koch in Germany. Pasteur, through his experiments with fermentation and food spoilage, proved that microorganisms were responsible for these processes. He demonstrated that heating liquids, a process now called pasteurization, could kill these microbes and prevent spoilage. He argued that if microbes could spoil wine, they could also cause diseases in humans and animals. It was Robert Koch who provided the smoking gun. He developed new techniques for growing bacteria in a lab. This allowed him to isolate a single type of bacterium and study it. In a series of groundbreaking experiments, he was able to prove that a specific bacterium, Bacillus anthracis, caused the disease anthrax. He went on to identify the bacteria that caused tuberculosis and cholera. He developed a set of criteria now called Koch's postulates for proving that a specific microorganism causes a specific disease. This was it. The germ theory of disease was no longer a theory. It was a proven fact. Looking back, it's easy to see medieval people as ignorant or superstitious. Their medical practices, like bloodletting, seem brutal. Their belief in miasma seems naive. But that view misses the point. They were not stupid. They were intelligent people working within the limits of their knowledge. Their world was one where the supernatural was real and where science was based on what the naked eye could observe. Their theories were rational attempts to explain a terrifying and unpredictable world. And in some ways, they weren't entirely wrong. Their belief in miasma, the idea that filth and bad smells cause disease, led them to clean their streets. This accidentally reduced the presence of germs. Their observation of contagion during the Black Death led them to invent quarantine, a public health tool that saved countless lives and is still used today. They were on a long journey of understanding. They took the first crucial steps. They identified the pattern of disease, even if they couldn't see the cause. The scientists who came later, like Pasteur and Koch, weren't starting from scratch. Well, they were building on centuries of observation, on the hard-earned lessons of pandemics, and on the simple, powerful idea that sickness could be passed from one person to the next. The medieval world may not have understood germs, but it did understand contagion. And that understanding changed everything.